20 minutes, just to make sure that you understand that I'm a fair chairman. Deputy Conway Welsh has switched her time with Deputy Doherty. So Deputy Doherty.
Thank you. And maybe just to stay on that theme first of all, the Central Bank of Ireland has now divested from all investments in companies that operate in the occupied territories. Is that the case?
Yes, but I'll bring Vaz in because it's a bit more complicated than what you've just said. But essentially, yes. Yes,
okay. And four of those were Israeli banks, was it? That was up.
Indeed.
Can you outline the rationale to this committee why the central bank took that decision? You weren't forced to take that decision. You know, it wasn't a legislative. Can you outline why you took that decision?
Yeah,
which is welcome, obviously.
Of course. Do you mind if I just give a little bit more context, because it is a bit more complicated? That's okay, but I'll be quick. So, as you know, we have a stock of investment assets that we use the returns from which fund our operating expenses, our operations, basically. The majority of those are invested in sovereign bonds in the euro area and in the US. There is about 4% of our total assets are invested in a portfolio of equities. These equities are managed on what is called a passive basis. So we are not an active investor. We don't actually choose the individual stocks. Instead, we ask an external asset manager to track an index on our behalf. We have, as we had in response to the letter from this committee last time, a sustainability policy, part of which is based on exclusions. And the exclusions are very much based on global norms. Now, as we said in the letter to you in May, our exclusion policy did not have an exclusion for the occupied territories. And indeed, there is no global norm for exclusions for investments in companies with potential activities in the occupied territories. So we looked at this following the questions that were raised here, and we judged, well, there was a different risk considerations, but one of the considerations was that it was a high risk that these 4 banks that we divested from were associated with the financing of settlements in the occupied territories. It was a risk-based judgment. So we took the risk-based decision to divest of those 4 companies.
I welcome the fact, and thank you for acknowledging the fact that the questioning in this committee and my own question has led to this. And this is a positive outcome, and I think it needs to be acknowledged from the central bank in relation to that. And hopefully the NTMA will also follow suit and divest from the rest of its holdings in companies that are involved in the occupied territories. But it does lead me to come to the issue of the war bonds that are being sold through the Central Bank of Ireland. Do you acknowledge that Israel is calling these war bonds? They are advertising them as war bonds. They are asking people to support the war efforts. It's on their website here. I can show it to you that these are war bonds. Do you acknowledge that in the first instance, that these are primarily to fund or at least that is how Israel is advertising these bonds?
Well, the prospectus itself does not. The prospectus itself does not say that. I haven't seen what you've just described. The prospectus doesn't say that. And as I explained earlier, the European regulations around this are pretty clear.
But do you expect, I understand that this perspective doesn't say that, but do you accept that Israel themselves are marketing these as war bonds?
Sorry, I haven't read the advert. I mean, they are Israeli government bonds. The extent to which money is fungible, I can't comment on that. I have no idea what the Israeli fiscal policy is and what their budget is. So I can't actually comment on your...
So if you open your mobile phone or any one of you and go to israelibonds.com, it's a very clear front page which is about support the war efforts by Israeli bonds.
Let me jump and accept that I'm jumping a little bit here, but accepting what you just said. There's nothing in the regulations that enables us or requires us to say these can't be approved. I mean, what we are required
I'll come to that in a minute, Governor.
Yeah.
And you've made that point in your opening statement and again in question to Richard Boyd Barrett.
Sure.
And indeed in the letter to the committee. But I do want to ask you and to acknowledge that Israel is promoting these as war bonds, because that is a really important issue here, to understand where this financing goes to and to what efforts. Because we know Israel has killed, what, more children than any war ever? More UN personnel than any war ever? More journalists than any war ever? They had our soldiers, our peacekeepers that you rightly described as the bravest of the brave, pinned down for the last number of days in Lebanon. And these are war bonds. And it's important that just in this moment in history, as we're seeing what's unfolding to us, that we acknowledge what Israel are calling them. Whatever the perspective they're giving you, do you acknowledge that Israel is asking people to support the war effort by purchasing these bonds?
I take your word for it. I have not explored in detail what you've just said.
That's fair enough. Can you confirm, so Ireland is the home country for Israeli bonds, is that correct?
Essentially, Ireland's been chosen since the United Kingdom left the EU. Ireland was chosen as the country to issue these.
And that allows then for people in Germany and Spain to purchase these bonds because Ireland is the home country and we're part of the European Union.
Indeed.
Did anybody in the central bank reach out to Israel after Britain left the EU and therefore couldn't be the home country for these bonds? Did anybody reach out to Israel from the central bank?
I'm pretty sure we didn't, but I don't know. But I think this is a choice made by the Israeli government and its advisors.
Could you check in terms of your?
Yeah, I can certainly check for you.
Okay, you say very clearly that your hands are tied. You didn't use those words, but that there's a legal responsibility on the central bank to authorise the sale of these bonds through Ireland, through the central bank as the home country by approving the perspectives. Is that correct? That you
as long as they meet the conditions.
Okay.
Yeah.
And you say that comes from the regulations that are there at European level. Is that correct? The 2017 regulations?
Yeah.
Okay. In those same regulations, does it not say in paragraph 8, it says the disclosure requirements of this regulation does not prevent a member state or competent authority, which the central bank is the competent authority in this case, or an exchange through its rule book from imposing other particular requirements in the context of the admission to trading of securities on a regulated market. Isn't that not the case?
Well, you're reading that.
Okay.
I don't have it in front of me.
So that means that this regulation here, which is about the requirement to provide a perspective and then for the competent authority to authorise that perspective, but it states very clearly here that you as a competent authority can impose other particular requirements in the context of admission to trading in securities. So do you acknowledge that the central bank had the powers under this regulation to add additional conditionality in terms of Israel selling war bonds in the middle of a genocide through the Central Bank of Ireland?
I'm not sure I do, Deputy, because the decision that we made at the time that we made it, I don't know if they were promoting things as war bonds. And secondly, I think our role is to a certain extent circumscribed by partly what the law says, but also what the facts are in front of us and what the expectations of us are as a national competent authority working within the European Union and within its framework.
When did you say last approve the prospectus?
I think in 21, but I'm not sure.
Okay.
I can check for you.
So it also says in this here, which I'm sure you're familiar with, although it is a big regulation, it also says here under Article 32 of this regulation, it says, in order to fulfil the duties under this regulation, competent authorities, which is the central bank, shall have, in accordance to national law, at least the following supervisory investigatory powers: to require issuers, offerers, or persons asking for admission to trading on a regulated market to include in the prospectus supplementary information where necessary for investor protection. So does that not allow you to say in this perspective that these to protect the investors, to protect people who are buying Israeli bonds, to say these bonds are for a war, which the International Court of Justice has said that there's plausible cause that they are committing a genocide, and that the central bank should not be supporting, authorising a perspective that doesn't have those words or terminology in them. This isn't shares in Coca-Cola. This is to kill kids. This is the destruction of an entire state. This is incursions into Lebanon and elsewhere. This is carpet bombing. This is ethnic cleansing at a massive scale. And you have the power here to require supplementary information where necessary for protection of investors. Can I ask you, did you look at that clause under Article 32? Are you going to look at that clause? And will you state that these bonds are being used now as war bonds and that the International Court of Justice has found that there's plausible cause to believe that there's a genocide being carried out by Israel who is using these bonds to fund their war efforts? I think that's the least. I have no doubt, I have absolutely no doubt that I would imagine that nobody in the central bank wants Ireland to be selling these bonds through the central bank, given what's happening. But I put it to you that you have enough wriggle room in this here to actually make sure that that doesn't happen. That should not be war bonds for this genocide, should not be sold through Ireland, should not be sold through the central bank, and you have enough in this perspective to actually ensure that you tell them to carry that language or you're not approving it. And if they don't like it, they can take a hike. It's not acceptable. And also I would put it to you, where in this perspective is there any sanction whatsoever to the Central Bank of Ireland if they didn't approve this perspective? It doesn't exist.
I'm very happy to take this away, Deputy, and to look at it in the way you've described, and to think very hard about the ability I have to do the sorts of things you want me to. I'm not going to today accept some of the statements you made because I feel that will be going way beyond what is reasonable. But just to be absolutely clear in what I said to Deputy earlier about my own views here, and which I am pretty sure represent the views of the people of the central bank, but also of most of the people in the country. And we, all of us are absolutely appalled at what is happening in the Middle East. And we, however, have to work within certain parameters. If those parameters allow us to do things that we haven't done, we'll look at it deeply and carefully. But just to be clear, this is different to, for example, the sanctions that have been imposed on Russia, where what we can do is also clear. What we have to do is also clear. Those sorts of moves have not been taken by the European Union. They have not been taken by the state. We remain, as I said, however deep felt the feelings we have for what's happening over there, we have to work within the framework of the law as it exists.
I appreciate that, and the European Union should move in this. They should move in this.
I can't really.
But what I'm saying to you, and I welcome what you've said, and I wouldn't expect you to say anything else, bar to take what I've said in a serious way, which you've acknowledged, and to go back and look at this, to look at what is there within the regulation, and to look whether there is a way not to have Ireland as a home country selling these war bonds. And I've made my point, I think, strongly enough in relation, and I would argue that it is the sentiment of the Irish people, and I would say the sentiment of the central bank as well. So I'll